Right, Greg, welcome to the latest edition of The High Ground. Last week we talked about air to ground sort of weapons, which is more my background, mud mover. This time we're going to look at sort of air to air, the sort of sport of kings. Now, I know you've sat both sides of this fence because you flew the Tornado, which was more of a mud moving aircraft, but you also did an exchange tour. So really interested in your perspective on all of this.
Yeah, it's nice to be the hunter instead of the hunted occasionally in life.
Yeah, but it's interesting to use that phrase because I think we used to carry around missiles ourselves, didn't we? But largely just to keep the hunting aircraft on their toes, because if they pop their head down into our mud moving environment and they couldn't find us all, one of us would jump on them. And yeah, it was probably not the smartest move in the world because you. But anyway, lots to get into
Yeah.
here. I think if we can start off, I mean, people sort of tend to think of Top Gun and it's all very modern. In fact, we go back to World War One. You know, the pilots there were trying to gain air superiority, weren't they? So they were trying to shoot each other down with handguns. In World War Two, that hadn't really advanced much. It was cannons now. So Spitfires, Hurricanes, Messerschmitts were all trying to shoot each other down, but they had to get behind each other. And therefore, the whole concept of air combat and being able to maneuver your aeroplane, was your aeroplane more maneuverable? What height could you do it at? And you and I, we sort of our first experiences of air combat was that, wasn't it? Because mine was at Cranwell. I don't know about you, but tail chasing. What about you?
Yeah, Linton on Ouse was my alma mater, if you like. Closed now, unfortunately. Yeah, so guns on an aeroplane were really the first means of shooting each other down. And initially, you're right, the people literally hanging out the side. But as aeroplanes got a bit faster, that became a bit silly. But the guns, of course, are fixed to the aeroplane. So you've got to point the aeroplane to point the gun. And in order to point the aeroplane and get a tracking solution, you've got to be able to fly behind another aircraft quite accurately in plane and basically point your gun just slightly ahead and pour lead at them. So all of the techniques that we used were all about getting behind and getting in plane. I was nearly about to use my hands there, but I won't do it. I won't do it.
Go on, go on.
For those that don't know, if you're in a bar as a fighter pilot and you get your hands out and you start pointing, it's a round of drinks for everybody. So I'm hoping that Sean won't apply the rules. And yeah, it's a really good way of learning how to handle your aircraft. But that is a very specific way of shooting, and in this day and age, quite frankly, a way of last resort.
It is, but I think it was interesting that it does transcend our era, doesn't it? I don't feel particularly old, and yet, you know, tail chasing was our first experience of that. I was in the JP5. I guess you were in the JP3, Jet
Yeah.
Provost 3. And the whole point of tail chasing was that if, as you say, the gun was fixed, it wasn't in the Jet Pro, but you'd have to therefore cut the corner a bit to lead turn to get them to fly through the bullets. And if you do that, you're going to catch up with them. You've also got to be fairly close for the gun to work, and therefore the danger is you very quickly end up overtaking them. And of course, that's a bit like the Top Gun thing. Oh, he's flown right by. Now you're the hunted rather than the hunting. So some really interesting techniques you've got to learn with tail chasing. It's a sort of three-dimensional game of chess. And I think for me, the next stage was a Valley. I don't know about you, but the Hawk was a fantastic little aeroplane, a sports car for doing combat. But my goodness, it could put a lot of G, and all of a sudden your base heights, G limits, situational awareness. I found it fantastic fun, but it blew your mind.
Yeah, I mean, and I can still vividly remember it. I mean, what you have brilliantly described, of course, is lead and lag pursuit in the technical term. And there's an analogy here. I just thought of it, actually, honestly. If you're in a Formula One racing car chasing another Formula One racing car, you've got limits. You've got to, well, ideally stay on the track. You can cut the corner a little bit. And I think that's the big difference. In a car, it's two-dimensional. You are literally following the other car on a track, but trying to go faster and trying to get around it. In combat, you can go up, down, left, right. There is no track, but every move has a consequence. And it's how you handle those consequences. And you're right, in order to get your gun to fire at another aircraft, you need to aim ahead. It's a bit like shooting a duck. You know, you've got to aim ahead of the thing, and your bullets have got to be where the duck's going to be when the bullets get there. Exactly the same on airplanes, but clearly quite a lot faster. And taking that lead means you start overtaking. Which means eventually you're going to end up in front. You're going to do the old Top Gun thing where it'll fly right by, and the next thing you know, you're being shot at. So yeah, it's quite an intricate piece of flying in order to stay behind or get a tracking solution.
Yeah, it's also interesting because I remember the days when we were first trying this, and of course, because you'd be cutting the corner to try and get the gun solution, you'd get closer, and we had a protective bubble. I can't remember how big it was, but it was a no-go within that
Yeah,
protective.
thousand feet,
Sorry?
1,000 feet.
Yeah, I never. It always seemed a long way,
Yeah,
and into a scissors when you're both, really low speed. You seem to get quite a lot closer than that. And I remember fighting with some of our European allies. I mean, it happened today. I was chatting to somebody who's out in Poland, and they said they've stopped fighting the Polish MiG-29s now because they just don't respect any bubble. They just get as close as they can. And of course, when you're slow speed, the aircraft isn't quite as maneuverable and responsive as it should have been. But
for any RAF lawyers still listening, Sean meant 1,000 feet and has always adhered to 1,000 feet, by the way.
always,
But
always.
you are right. I have certainly been in some scenarios where, shall we say, the interpretation of 1,000 feet was somewhat different to mine. And I can tell you some stories. Well, I won't go into great detail, but in an F-18, when you're in a slow-speed scissors, which is effectively two aeroplanes spiraling around each other, sometimes just going down at very slow speed at high alpha, it is quite it focuses the mind, shall we say.
But actually, when you're on that, I mean, I do think, without getting too much into specific bits, the Harrier was rubbish at air combat. Relatively small wing, massive intakes, not great deal of thrust when you got to height. But it had one party trick, which was pulling the nozzles in, which meant that you could suddenly get a lot of nose authority. But it was what we used to call a departure lever because you had one chance. You're in a slow speed. Suddenly, you'd yank a load of nozzle in, haul the nose round, loads of top rudder, point the aircraft and either fire or whatever. But the next thing that was going to happen, it was going to depart. And
Yeah.
it's not like spinning. It just literally falls out the sky and you've got to try and catch the bits. So it wasn't a great way. It was death or glory.
Yeah, it's a last gasp maneuver. And if you wanted to debrief the whole of Top Gun and Top Gun 2 for that matter, there are some maneuvers in there that really, are not, shall we say, recommended in real combat. And of course, I think this is the case in the Second World War in particular. It wasn't always the aeroplane that you were fighting that killed you. It was the one you didn't see. And so air combat isn't just about one versus one anymore, if it ever was. And it's so much more important now to have a complete understanding of everything around you, what's going on. And more often than not, speed is life, literally. So, yeah, doing all these clever maneuvers looks great and looks great at air shows. But in an air-to-air combat, it makes you the center of the fight, which is never a good place to be.
Yeah, and it is funny though, isn't it? Because we call it the Sport of Kings, and we used to call them a knife fight in a phone box because you'd be all over each other like a rash. But in reality, that's not how these things are fought at all. But it was very good for training situational awareness because I remember 1v1, basically you'd go point at each other, point away from each other, point at each other, go past each other, game on, and now you'd be fighting. And so if it's just 1v1, you'd have to have a plan. And part of that would be you're now traveling at, I don't know, you're not quite Mark 1, but the combined speed of the two of you is close to Mark 2. So you're disappearing out of view pretty quickly. But you can climb, you can hide in the sun, you can dart behind the clouds, there's all sorts, you've got to have a plan, haven't you? And then, of course, you go from 1v1 to 2v1 to 2v2 to 3v3. And all of a sudden, trying to work out where your mates are, where the enemy is, while you're upside down, pulling G, trying to work. It's a phenomenal exercise for mental agility.
Yeah, and you need to understand your aeroplane as well, because I think a lot of people assume that you just go as fast as you possibly can and put as much D as you can. Actually, aeroplanes are quite defined beasts, and every one has its sort of corner where it performs to its best, and that'll be a speed and a G and an alpha and a height where it is optimally turning at the best possible rate. And the trick, of course, is finding yours and exploiting the bad corners of your enemy so that you can outturn, outrun, or outfight the opposition. But even so, that, as you say, that's still in a close-in environment, and that's not going to resolve an aeroplane that's 40 miles away as you locked on and is now sending a missile your way as you merrily turn in circles.
Yeah, a really good point because our certainly the Harrier, it wasn't really that good at any of that stuff. The good thing was it was quite small, and if you flew at low level, it was quite difficult to see. So you've flown both sorts. So what were the relative strengths of the Tornado and the F-18 in this world? What were the areas that you try and drag the fight into?
I think Tornado was very similar to you, especially in the air to ground world. You know, we relied on trying to fly low, as fast as possible and just get away. And that sometimes just meant splitting up. And it sounds awful to say. It's a bit like a herd of antelope being chased by a lion. You know, the sickest, slowest one at the back gets caught and the rest of you get away. And it was quite brutal. So, yeah, it was very much about survival. A lot of people say we were flying low to evade radar, and there's some truth in that. The other reason we used to fly low is that missiles have a fuse system that go off in proximity to the target. If you can get the missile to come down to you, you can get it to fuse off the ground. So there's all sorts of techniques. It's not all over once the missile's in the air. You've got a variety of techniques, whether it's chaff and flares to deceive the missile or even get it to fuse off the ground. So yeah, a Tornado was very much go as fast as you can, head off in as many different directions as you can and run away. The F-18, very different. I mean, you've got your own weapons. So actually, you've got a decision to make. Do I turn back into the threat and shoot it down? You know, there's no better way to take on an enemy by punching it in the face first. Or again, you could also run away at speed. But the F-18 was an incredibly maneuverable aeroplane at slow speed. And you could beat almost anything under 300 knots. But getting everything down to 300 knots is never a good place to be. So yeah, you had to really think on your feet to literally do the right thing at the right time, depending on the scenario.
Yeah, so it's probably worth getting to the weapons because although we started off, we talked about guns, and a lot of fast jets had guns, but it wasn't really the way you're going to shoot down other airplanes. There's really two sorts of missiles. So the infrared missiles, in other words, they home in on an infrared, the heat signature. Advantage of those is obviously, there's no radar signature, so unless the guy's looking out carefully, you're going to see it coming. And actually, they were the first to be brought into service. I think it was the 1950s. Firestreak was, and of course, it brought up the term Fox 2, which was an infrared missile is on its way. But I think you and I probably grew up in the sort of AIM-9 family, Air Intercept Missile 9, which has been around was likely to be around for over 100 years. But I think it was the 9 Golf, which was the first one that had real punch. But that was still, you had to be behind the 3-9 line, in other words, behind the other aircraft, in order for it to pick up the infrared signature. So it still needed you to dogfight your way around. And we had some spectacular fights when we were only armed with 9 Golfs. And it eventually came back to a knife fight in a phone box. But those infrared missiles were incredibly capable. But people tend to think, you mentioned earlier, that once it's in the air, you've had it. There was a lot of ways of countering those, weren't there?
There were. And maybe it's worth at this point just describing some of those terms that you just used there. So Fox is a NATO code word for a missile firing. And there's Fox 1, 2, 3, 4. Fox 1 is a semi-active radar missile, so it requires your aircraft to illuminate another aircraft and the missile homes in on it. Fox 2, as you mentioned, is infrared. Fox 3 is a semi-active, is an active missile that effectively can home in on its own radar energy, so you can effectively fire and forget. And then Fox 4 is commonly known as a guns kill, but I think most people would say guns rather than Fox 4. So there are all those differences. They all have different counters. So we talk about Fox 2, so an infrared. You're right, the very, very early infrared detectors were only really able to see a hot engine at its hottest place, which is at the back, which is why you had to fire it from behind. So actually, it wasn't dissimilar to a gun. It meant you had to maneuver to get behind the other aircraft. Nowadays, the more modern AIM-9Xs and derivatives thereof, ASRAMs, etc., they are capable of seeing heat from almost anywhere. They will certainly see heat from the front of the engine. They'll even see heat off the surface of the aircraft. And so they are able to do head-on shots at quite some distance. The beauty of any missile, of course, is you can fire off bore sight, which instantly means you don't have to get behind. You don't even have to point at the other aircraft. So you can fire it off bore sight. Even a semi-active missile that you have to lock on. With the F-18, for example, we had a really wide radar with 70 degrees either way. So you could shoot 70 degrees off your nose. So you weren't having to point or even get close to the other aircraft. And the counters, as you rightly say, for an IR missile were flares, still used today for any IR missile, aimed to decoy the missile away, Although missiles have got clever now, they can spot a decoy because a decoy slows down, and they'll just keep climbing up the decoys to find you. And for the semi-active active missiles, it's chaff. You're trying to create basically a radar cloud that deceives the weapon. But again, also they're quite clever at missing those these days.
Yeah, but sticking with the sort of IR missiles at the moment, because I do think we tend to gloss over those a little bit. But as you say, flares. But there's been a whole technology around flares, hasn't there? As you say, initially flares came out that seduced the missile. I think the early missiles only had an 8% hit rate. By the time you got to the 9 Lima in the Falkland Islands, I think there was something like 24 were launched by the Sea Harriers, 21 of which hit their target and was successful. And part of that was because they had a way of avoiding the flares. So a new generation of flares was invented called black flares, wasn't it? Where you wouldn't necessarily see them coming out, but the signature was a bit closer to that of an engine. Likewise, if you fly into a cloud, infrared missiles can't follow you into cloud because you suddenly lose the signature altogether. As you said, proximity. You did a bit of QY stuff around this as well. So do you remember was it called a zirconian disc that blew up in a winder? Explain how that works. They're called missiles, not hittiles, for a reason, aren't they?
They are. So if you look inside the warheads of a missile like that, some are different, but let's talk about this one. It was effectively an expanding rod that had been just folded up. You know those rulers you can get that you just fold up and put in your pocket when you're a carpenter? It's like a really big one of those with a diameter, I can't remember exactly, let's say about 20, 30 feet, quite big. So as the warhead explodes, this disc effectively of quite strong metal, zirconium as you say, comes out and effectively expands and becomes like a buzzsaw that literally cuts through anything it can find. So more often than not, you'll see any aircraft, if you look at being shot down by an infrared missile, you'll tend to see bits of it coming off as it. Now, if that happens to be a fuel tank, you'll see an explosion, but it might just be the tail of the aeroplane. And I think one thing that people forget, if you're dropping flares, you only have a finite number of them. And, we're not going to go into numbers, but it'll be in the tens, not the hundreds. And, eventually you run out of them. So a canny fighter pilot sat behind someone throwing out flares, just waits till they stop coming. And then finally, gives this coup de grace. So, and in the Falklands, I'm not belittling what was done in the Falklands, but a lot of those attacks were against aircraft attacking ships or running away in straight lines. They weren't fighters. They weren't therefore doing sort of effectively an offensive maneuver against them. So they were largely able to get in behind them and use those weapons very effectively. So it was a perfect fight for something like a 9 Golf 9 Lima and worked very well.
Yeah, but it's also a maneuver, wasn't there? Because one of the things that we spent quite a lot of time looking at, you'd imagine once a missile's in the air, these generally travel at sort of Mach 3, they generally can outrun you. But of course, most of the modern missiles, they're predictor missiles. In other words, they fly to where you're going to be, not where you are. So if you're turning a corner, they have to lead that corner to intercept you. And if you're constantly changing plane, the point of intercept can move quite a long way through the skies. And although these missiles are generally, I think, 50G missiles, so far more maneuverable than a jet is, you can pretty quickly force it into missing you by greater distances than the fuse can cope with, can't you?
Yeah, and that's quite, I mean, the physics on this is quite complicated, but it can pull a lot of G. But you've got to remember, they've got quite small fins. So these aren't that aerodynamic missiles. For good reason, they're designed to go very fast, very quickly. And it's also, that's another thing against them. If you're doing Mach 3, 4, 5, you need to pull 50G to match an aeroplane pulling 8 or 9G at 500 knots. So, you can, in theory, outmaneuver the missile. And so breaking into it, pulling your throttles back, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but takes away some of the heat source, might just create enough of a miss distance so the missile, yes, it goes bang, but it goes bang far enough away, doesn't cause you any damage. The problem is you're now pulling back into the thing shooting at you and you've just slowed down. So be ready for the next one, or hope that your mate gets there to bail you out.
I know, it was this is why it was a sport of kings, because there was so many variables, weren't there? And I remember when you were taking a new kid up, I remember the great fun we had when, I was doing stage command at the time. You must be the same. Friday afternoons, you wouldn't get much flying. So when you got the chance, you take up one of the kids to let him kick you around the skies. And of course, he never did. And this, the young pilot would go, "Oh, the old man, he doesn't get much flying. I'll show him how to do combat." And of course, it's the wily dog, isn't it, versus the young pup. And you could watch him pulling the wings off this thing, and you just pick him off, and he never had a plan when he came into the merge. Therefore, you'd go into the sun, or it was just so funny. And you get down and debrief these things. The other thing, how on earth did you debrief? Because I still found it years on quite difficult, because you do a fight, then you stop, you're short of gas, so you go straight into another fight. You've had a three-dimensional game of, chess going on, and you've got to debrief it when you get down. What was your tip for doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a skill you learn as you do more of it, because there are only so many ways that things happen, and you only need to remember some of the key learning lessons. I mean, the best people out there will literally be able to recreate the entire fight in their head. The great thing is now, of course, we've got video. Chances are you're being instrumented if you're on exercise, so the whole thing is literally being recorded externally, so that there's no lying or making stuff up. Everything is there for everyone to see. But I used to find after a fight, and as you know, a fight will last a couple of minutes maybe, when you're setting up for the next one, jotting down as many things that you can remember just on your knee pad, just so you can recall it. Fight one was like this, fight two was a two-circle fight, this is what happened, you went high, I went low, and you can just rebuild the key lessons. You're right about the young guns. I mean, the analogy I use is it's playing rugby when you're older. And I don't know about you, but I was a back row. And as you get older, you don't chase the ball. You go, where's the ball going to be in 40 seconds time? Right, it's probably going to be over there. Right, I'm going to start heading that way. And actually, fighting in air combat is very much about anticipation. It's about being where you think the fight is heading, or what the other person is going to do, and being ready there and waiting for them. So it's experienced heads that learn those tricks. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they make algorithms think like this. Because if all the algorithm does is match the best performance, does that necessarily be the way you win the fight? Especially if there's more than one aeroplane out there. So there's a really fascinating time to come here to see how machines start to think through some of these challenges, because you do get better with age, and it's not something you can explain why you did. It's not like there's a mathematical formula that takes you to that solution. It's an appreciation of a three-dimensional picture that you can then almost instantly go, right, I need to be doing this, or I need to go in that direction. So it's a hard skill to learn, but once you get it, it becomes intuitive.
Yeah, and also, as you say, I mean, it does depend on your enemy as well, because you've got to make is he on the top of his game? Is he a junior guy? What's the weather doing? Is there lots of cloud around? Is the sunshine high or low in the sky? Is he going to have a lot of fuel left, so wanted to get this over quickly, or is he going to be able to hang around and play me long? And actually, I mean, although we're talking about yipping and yarning, I do think it was interesting. I was doing a bit of research for this, that obviously the 9 Lima was something that we fired a bit, and I actually fired one at Aberporth, who used to have a training allocation. I think it was a 9 Golf actually we fired, but shooting at a Jindavik, and it all had to be carefully sequenced. You were worried sick about losing it. But this was years ago, and I recognised that 9X is the sort of more modern American version of the weapon, and it was only 2023 when you remember the F-22 shot down that Chinese spy balloon, and very impressive because it was incredibly high or whatever. So these weapons still have a utility today, and they are very capable.
Yeah, I mean, you can fire them beyond visual range. I mean, so what we used to do in my day in the FA team, which is still a long time ago, you would find somebody on radar, but you would actually flick through the different weapons. So you'd go through your AIM-7 Sparrow, which was your semi-active, and you'd also select your AIM-9. And, sometimes 10, 15 miles, if the airplane was above you at height, and that tone tells you the missile is seeing a heat signature. And it might be a much better way to go to fire that missile, because it's not going to send radar energy to the target. And therefore, you might just be able to shoot it down without it knowing it's coming. So, yeah, ASRAMs, AIM-9Xs, they still have a place, because they don't really give the aircraft being targeted much warning. And they'll home in on that radar, on that heat signature. So, yeah, they've still got a place, absolutely.
Yeah, I think if you've got so ASRAM is obviously the very latest of those from the MBDA stable. But as you say, you generally need to have a radar, because to at least work out where these things are, because otherwise, if you can't see them, you can't can't drop your sensor on to see if they can see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's true in the basic sense. But of course, in this day and age, other things might see them for you. So if, for example, a space-based sensor or an AWACS sees these aeroplanes, they can pass you on data link where they are. So you don't have to turn your radar on. You can use infrared search and track, which is pretty impressive. On the Typhoon, it's kind of undersold a little bit and not really talked about very much. But if you look at a Typhoon, just forward of the cockpit on the left-hand side, there's this like black bulbous glass thing. And that is an infrared search and track system, which you can then use passively to find heat sources. And it's deliberately mounted there because it's kind of wanting to look up at aircraft rather than on the ground. And that's another passive way of detecting targets. And you can pick these up at tens of miles. So yeah, there's a variety now of different ways of knowing where everyone else is without necessarily giving away your own location, which is particularly important, of course, if you're a stealthy aircraft. Because if you're a stealthy aircraft and you're not emanating any energy, you're a devil to see.
Which I think is a quite nice crib onto, because that's the infrared missiles. But of course, there's also radar missiles. Now, the downside of infrared is generally they're relatively short range because they've got to pick up that the heat signature, and there's lots of reasons why clouds, atmospheric conditions, sun, or whatever might stop you doing that. I never flew with radar missiles because we never had a radar, but you did. Obviously, there were two main types, as you said. There's the semi-active, in other words, the aircraft has to paint the target and the radar, the missile hones in on it. But the fire forgets, it's sort of AMRAAMs, which I suspect is what you flew with the F-18. Now that creates a completely different narrative. And although we're just going to talk briefly about the missile, it's completely changed the way that air combat is done as well.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of the semi-active is a number of things. One is you can target multiple aeroplanes because you're not having to paint any one particular aircraft. And secondly, you can now be escaping whilst your missile carries on heading towards the target. Whereas with a semi-active missile, you had to continue to paint the aircraft, which means you've got to keep going forwards. Now, in the F-18, we could kick off by about 65, 70 degrees right on the edge of our radar, and you would try and get as much separation from the other person as possible. And it then became a game of who dies first, because if you can kill the other person, their radar stops working, their missile stops working. So that was just a game of who can stay furthest away. With AMRAAM and missiles like it, Meteor and others, it really is about, right, how many can I put in the air? How many can I now guarantee with a relatively high PK by firing them in the heart of what's known as their envelope? And then I'm going to head backwards, go and reload and do it all over again. And if that takes out 4 to 8 aircraft, I've done my job, and I'll come back tomorrow and do it again. So yeah, it has completely changed the nature of air fighting. Active missiles, much harder to defeat and much easier to employ in some regards. And of course, I think we saw that in India and Pakistan. You know, the sort of missile war that took place there, that we're seeing airplanes now fighting each other from very large distances, exchanging missiles rather than getting close enough to start exchanging bullets.
And this is where stealth comes into its own, isn't it? Because I know some people sort of talk about stealth as being, right, you're invisible. No, you're not invisible. All it means is you can get closer to the enemy before he can see you. And that means that you can get closer to him to get a missile in the air and then start running away before he even knows you're on your way there. And as you say, if you data link the position of the enemy, you also don't have to give away your own. So these mid ranges now are up to 100 miles away, aren't they? So it's less about Russian aircraft performing Cobra maneuvers at air shows and fighting to get behind somebody, and much more about a bit of stealth to get closer, long-range missiles with a high PK, probability of kill. But they're also getting quite expensive, aren't they?
They're definitely expensive, and they're much more complicated. And we're not seeing the same development of air-to-air drones as we've seen in air-to-ground drones in Ukraine, for good reason. Air-to-air is difficult and therefore requires a lot more technology. And I think it's really important here. You can quote the range of a missile all day long. The key range here is the range of detection. If you can detect a target at 50 miles, you can shoot them at 50 miles. If your weapon goes 100 miles, that's great. But you can now detect and shoot. If you can't detect somebody till 10 miles, because you've got stealth characteristics of your aircraft, you can't be engaged with a long-range missile. So the long-range missiles are pointless. So the game now is who can see who first and furthest away, get their missiles in the air before they've even been detected. And that is why things like Red Flag, where F-35s have participated, or even Typhoons working with F-35s, we're seeing kill ratios go from 2 to 1, 3 to 1 in a fair fight to 10, 15, 20 to 1, because it's becoming an unfair fight. Now, has the other side also achieved the same level of stealth capability? I mean, we'll have to wait and see. We're obviously seeing it in China and Russia on paper. But when you look at those airplanes, particularly when you look at the Russian airplanes, they look very modern, very, very futuristic. Get up close to them and you can see great big rivets and bolts. And it's those rivets and bolts that reflect radar energy. And if there are gaps between the panels and if the paint isn't effective, and. So, yeah, there's a lot to learn here about just how good each side's stealth is. And unfortunately, we probably won't find out until the shooting starts. I am pretty confident that we are doing it to a high degree. I'm less impressed with the way Russia does it. And I think the fact that we don't see Russian aircraft trying to use that stealth to encroach further into Ukraine is perhaps an indicator that they don't trust it either.
Yeah, so let's talk briefly about the ways that you can counter then these sort of missiles. Because again, the danger is they sound like Operation Certain Death, but they're not, are they? The one I guess, there's chaff, there's maneuver, stuff like that, and we talked about stealth, but electronic warfare is the other one. We both lived through a time in the Cold War where there was constant counters and then counters, and without getting into the sort of, I'm not smart enough to know the secrets of it, but you can seduce a radar into believing that you're not where you actually are, to paint your picture as moving in a different speed, a different height, or whatever. That technology was really clever, and we were staying on top of it. It feels like for the last few decades we've not been doing that, and that was a very effective counter to radar missiles, wasn't it?
I think it's fair to say over the last couple of decades, particularly during the sort of counterinsurgency years, we weren't as focused on that part of development as maybe we could have been. I actually think the Air Force wasn't bad, actually. I think Air Forces have retained a lot of skills and a lot of development in those spaces. Maybe we haven't invested in it as much as we could have done, but I think we have been continuing the research. And what we now see are these jammers. They can either be in a pod, carried on the aircraft itself, that sends signals to the missile that confuses the missile or the radar. Or you can tow a decoy. You can put it on a long piece of wire, a good 100, 200 feet behind you to decoy. The reason you're decoying from 200 feet away is it might get homed on, because there's such a thing as called home on jamming by the missile. So you don't want it home on you want it home on the jammer that's 200 feet behind you. And there are now deployable jammers, decoy jammers. Bright Cloud is one made by Leonardo, where you literally decoy a very small electronic transmitter that goes out into the ether and tells missiles to come and get them. So there's a variety of different ways now that are playing in the electromagnetic spectrum. And that is the area that is probably most likely to see success. Things like chaff clouds now are so easily countered, because obviously it very quickly becomes a blooming cloud that doesn't move. It just bursts into the airspace. And missiles are quite clever now at figuring out what that is and avoiding it. So, yeah, lots of different techniques. And the electromagnetic ones are the key here.
So I guess my sort of final question on this would be around training, because, again, you and I spent some fantastic times in Red Flag in Nellis, high-end, Third World War scenarios. And there were times when I remember some of the financiers and some of the naysayers saying, look, we're not doing those wars anymore. Why are you training high-end? Looking back on it, and thankfully it's still going, it feels like that is the answer to the Maiden's Prayer, because the Americans were very good, goodness knows, but they'd got a whole load of very capable enemy equipment, and they had people using it who were very good at it. Day one, we'd always be slaughtered. And actually, by the end of the second week, you were starting to hold your own and know how to survive. What a great way of doing it when you're not actually dying. Do you think we're seeing a resurgence in the value of exercise like Red Flag, or do you think we're going to just end up doing more of this synthetically?
I don't think we've ever forgotten. I think we probably wanted to do more than we were necessarily allowed to, because we were committed elsewhere. And maybe the biggest mistake was having it just next door to Las Vegas, because I think everyone was suspicious that we weren't really working hard at all. Of course we were. And it is not cheap to go on these exercises, but the reason that exercise was created, way back to the 50s, 60s, when I think it was designed, is the stats told you that the first 10 sorties of your war were critical. In Vietnam, if you survived 10 sorties, you are far more likely to survive, for months and years. You were going to make a mistake in the first 10 trips. But the whole idea of red flag was, right, come here and make those mistakes here. Do those first 10 missions in the safety of an exercise environment. So your 11th trip is going to be in war and you're going to be ready to roll. And I do think that the more realistic our training is against the right threats, the more it creates that feeling in yourself of how am I going to cope in this? You're absolutely right. The synthetics do allow us to do that to a degree. We may well talk about that in a podcast not far away. Let's not give away any secrets. But, there's also that fear factor, knowing, and although red flag, you don't actually die, although people did, of course, the ground was never far away. But when you were shot synthetically. But you were embarrassed. You were there in the debrief, you got shot, and you would walk with your tail between your legs for the next 24 hours till you shot somebody else. And so there was a fear factor. And I think it's so important that people are able to experience the adrenaline rush of what it's like to be in a combat situation where your life literally is on the line, or those of your mates on your wing. So yeah, absolutely valuable.
So I guess my sort of corollary of all of that is that you and I are students of air power, air superiority, the ability to dominate the skies over enemy territory is so fundamental. And yet, for the last 35 years, we've largely been involved in wars of choice, over Afghanistan. Nobody's been competing with the skies. Over Iraq, they didn't really compete with the skies or whatever. All our future conflicts, they're going to be fighting over the skies. That air superiority is going to be something that will be vital. Otherwise, we're going to lose the war on the ground. It just feels like we might have risked taking our eye off the ball. And therefore, where do you think, whether it's IR missiles, radar missiles, numbers, quantity, quality, where have we got to go with this? Because it feels like we haven't been investing in this stuff properly for the last few years, for the defence review and for the future of air power. Where's the priorities, do you think?
Yeah, I think we've kept up with the technology to a degree, because there's no doubt that aeroplanes are at the relatively high end of the spectrum. What we probably haven't done enough of is invest in the weapons and the support necessary to deliver the rate of effort that you might need to do in a conflict where air superiority is challenged, as you just described. And I think Ukraine is a really good example of a war where air superiority has not been achieved by either side, and it's become a static war of attrition that has now been grinding on in its fourth year. Which is not how we want to fight. I think the way we're going to see developing now, and it comes back to your point about defeating different missile systems, is I think we are going to see a mix of drones that begin to make that environment more complex, but actually allow you to become more survivable. So actually, why not send 20, 30, 40 dumb drones ahead of you to take the missile shots, let the Russian aeroplanes fire their very clever missiles. But by the time you turn up, they've all run out. And now you can start to impose on them. And then, of course, the trick is you then attack their airfields, their infrastructure, their command and control, and you begin to poke their eyes out. So you don't necessarily take it on Air Force versus Air Force, but by penetrating deeper and getting closer to their critical vulnerable points, you begin to take down their entire system. It's something Ukraine is beginning to do in Russia, but it's not really been able to do because it hasn't had the tools. And at the moment, Russia's a big country. Obviously, it's quite hard to do, even for Ukraine with their new drones. But I think that's where we're going to see changes. And I think air control or air superiority is the key to winning those types of fights. It's the same with China. If you can achieve air superiority over those sort of chain of islands, what's known as the 9-dash line, then that's how you impose your will on the other side. I think it's a far trickier problem in China, to be frank. It's a whole different subject. But against Russia, I think we are well equipped to be able to do that, and we'll get better and better as some of these drones and some of these decoys, jammers, and we begin to present the most complicated air picture possible to the other side, that they really can't figure out what's going on.
Do you think numbers though? I mean, I think one of the things that you look back to, I know it's World War II, nearly 100 fighter squadrons, nearly 400 squadrons total. The SDR of 2010 took us down to single figures of squadrons. Which makes you very vulnerable to to attacks, and not able to withstand any form of attack from your enemy. I just wonder whether there is an argument, and you talk about quantity having quality all of its own, if you have drones that are sucking up some of that stuff. But it still feels that we have a very small number these days of these aircraft. We haven't really cherished them because we've got to have them. Yes, we've got very capable platforms, but not enough of them. If we're going to a war where your enemy has a lot of them and is prepared to lose a lot, if we're going to establish air superiority, which is absolutely a prerequisite for fighting, do we have the tools to do it?
I mean, that is exactly the question to ask. And you're right. We are devoid of sheer numbers. I mean, if you look at Ukraine will receive, 1,000 drone attacks a night? Not 1,000, 100, 200 drone attacks a night. That's an awful lot of aeroplanes and or weapon systems on the ground to shoot all those down. My only positive, and whenever I talk about this, I'm always looking at it through a NATO lens. If NATO pulls its assets together, we're still a formidable air force, when it's all joined together. If the UK was to go it alone, we've got too few. There's no doubt about that. And I think up until now, we've always assumed that won't be the case. I think we are having to now question whether America will be there holding our back, and we need to think through. But even if you just look at the European air forces and pull those assets, we're quite a formidable force. A lot of 5th gen, high-end 4th gen aeroplanes. Most nations now are pretty capable of operating those. So I'm upbeat from a NATO perspective. If honest truth, if you told me to pick a figure, I would double the size of the UK's combat air force. I think we are too small. That's not going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen in a rush. But I think we should be aiming. The arrow should be up. And we should be looking to get to a better number than we've got right now, because we will run out. And you can only carry so many missiles on an aircraft. And you've got to then recycle the aeroplanes. So, it's tough. Not forgetting, of course, we're defending the Falklands. We're defending other parts of the world and. So, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so on that front, probably news time, things that capture news. I'm going to take the first one this time because it segues nicely onto what you've just said. Very sad to see that 2 days ago, another Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot lost his life. It's not entirely clear how he's lost his time. They talked about it was recovering to the airfield and crashed. There'll obviously be an inquiry, but incredibly sad that this Major Sergei Bondar, who I think was one of the deputy commanders, very experienced guy, lost his life. And I think it just plays to the fact that we don't know whether he was shot down or whether he'd ran out of fuel or whether they had emergency. But these things happen, and they happen more often in war, which again puts the whole focus on you've got very few pilots now in the West, very few assets. You are going to lose a few in war. It's just a very sad day this week that, yes, another MiG-29 guy has passed away.
Yeah, I saw that too. I think he retired and came back, didn't he? Because he was like 46 or something. A lot of respect for anybody that is doing that for their nation, particularly if they volunteer to come back and have a go. But it just goes to show that sometimes it's not combat that kills you. Aeroplanes aren't very forgiving. And Ukraine is operating in an environment where they're probably lights out, operating from remote strips. That's dangerous stuff.
Well, certainly. I mean, certainly night flying. I don't know about you, but I think they was flying at night at the time. And if you don't have all of the we had goggles, infrared, the lights, and it was still odd times at night. It was incredibly difficult. You get so many illusions at night. Certainly one time, the nearest I got to actually killing myself was flying over water. I think it was in the Lake District at night. And I just looked away for a second to look inside because there was no reason to be focused. The next thing, the radar went off and I was ploughing through 100 feet on the way down because you just couldn't see. You were just seeing reflection in the water. You had no way of knowing how high you were. And I have a huge amount of respect when you're flying at night. Yes, it is a routine way of operating, but my goodness, it is incredibly dangerous as well.
Yeah, definitely. And mine. I'll keep it topical. I mean, there was a story a couple of days ago. I commented on my Twitter feed of allegedly a Rafale shooting down an F-35 and making a big noise about it. And as these things tend to do, that tends to hit the headlines because people like to take pot shots at the F-35 and America. France in particular will like to do that. And if you happen to be buying a Rafale and not buying F-35, brackets India, you might see something quite amusing in that story. And therefore, making claims like that then become sort of headline news is a little bit of a cruel trick, shall we say. The way I view these things is, you know and I know that when you're training, you tend to do all sorts of different scenarios where sometimes you pretend to be the bad guy, they pretend to be the bad guy. You impose limits on each other for certain scenarios. And yes, occasionally you might find yourself saddled in behind an F-35, getting some nice HUD film that makes it look like that you have taken on an F-35 and beaten it. What it doesn't tell you is that the F-35 had fired 17 missiles into you prior to that point. And this was the post-merge bit where, yes, you know, when you're close in against an F-35, a Rafale may well be able to hold its match with an aeroplane. In the end, has to obey the laws of physics like any other airplane. That's not what the F-35 is ultimately, you know, optimized for. It's stealth and all that stuff. But an F-35 can still maneuver pretty well. But yeah, that caught my eye because what it actually tells you is there's another game going on in the background, probably through some business development individual working for Rafale or Matra and or Dassault and enjoying taking a bit of a pot shot. I think if Lockheed Martin was to put all the HUD film of all the missile shots of all the Rafales F-35s have shot down at Red Flag, we might see a bit of a deluge. So yeah, never quite believe what you see on the internet.
No, I'm with you, and I think it goes back full circle, doesn't it? From from the days when World War II, everybody's fighting knife fight in a phone box. These days, some of the Russian aircraft air shows do look incredibly, maneuverable. The Cobra maneuvers, all this sort of thing. You think, wow, how on earth do they do that? They must be unbeatable. But you go, that's not the way we fight these days. It is at distance. It is about stealth, and actually, it's less about these knife fights in a phone box. But yes, as you say, there's lots of other agendas going on with some of these stories.
Yeah, exactly. You raise a really interesting point. I often tell people this. I'm not sure they believe me, but a lot of the Russian display flying is done by test pilots. Whenever you see them, they all look like quite wizened older blokes, a bit like you and me, who've been around the block and know how to handle those aeroplanes. They do not use line pilots to do that because they probably kill themselves every single time. And even the Russians have had a few accidents in displays, let's be honest. Whereas in the West, we let frontline squadron pilots do our displays. They do a quick workup and off they go because the aeroplanes are so much easier to handle and a bit more forgiving. So yeah, it's another lesson about how Russia approaches the way that it shows off its capabilities. Looks great at an air show. Now let's see one of your young sprogs do that, who's only got 50 hours under their belt, who has mostly spent all their training time going up and down in a very predictive, very scripted maneuver. So yeah, don't believe everything you see. That would be my lesson.
No, I love it. Sport of Kings. Greg, thanks for your time today.
Cheers, Sean.
Cheers.